The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, cream-colored and formal, with a return address from a law firm I'd never heard of in Philadelphia. I held it in my hands for a long moment before opening it, standing in the small kitchen of my apartment in Columbus, Ohio. At 50 years old, I'd learned that unexpected mail rarely brought good news. The coffee maker gurgled behind me as I slid my finger under the seal. Inside was a letter requesting my presence at the reading of a will. My Uncle Gerald's will. I hadn't spoken to Uncle Gerald in 28 years, not since the Thanksgiving when everything fell apart. I set the letter down on the counter and stared at it, my reflection ghost-like in the window above the sink. Outside, the November morning was gray and cold. My hands were steady, but something inside me shifted, like a foundation stone being moved after decades of stillness. The estrangement hadn't happened all at once. It had been a slow erosion, beginning when I was 22 and made the decision that would define my relationship with my family for the next 3 decades. I'd been accepted to law school, the pride of my parents, the golden child who would finally bring prestige to the family name. My father had already begun telling people at his Rotary Club meetings about his son, the future attorney. But that summer, I'd taken a job as a construction apprentice to earn tuition money, and something unexpected happened. I fell in love with the work, the precision of measurements, the satisfaction of building something tangible, the camaraderie of the crew. When I told my parents I wanted to become a contractor instead, my mother actually laughed. She thought I was joking. My father's face had turned a deep red. "You want to throw away your future to swing a hammer?" he'd said, his voice shaking with anger and disappointment. The final break came at my Uncle Gerald's house that Thanksgiving. My older brother Marcus was there, fresh from his second year of medical school, golden and approved. My younger sister Jennifer had just gotten engaged to a financial analyst from New York. And there I was, in my work boots, because I'd come straight from a job site, my hands still bearing the calluses and small cuts that marked my chosen profession. My Aunt Diane had looked at my hands with barely concealed disgust when I'd helped her carry dishes to the table. "Don't you have gloves?" she'd asked. The dinner conversation had circled around Marcus's achievements, Jennifer's upcoming wedding, and carefully avoided any mention of what I was doing with my life. Until my father had too much wine and decided to address it directly. "It's not too late," he'd announced to the table. I spoke to Dean Morrison. He said if you reapply, they'd still consider you. I'd set down my fork slowly, feeling every eye on me. "I'm happy doing what I'm doing," I'd said quietly. My mother had made a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. "Happy? You're wasting your education, your potential, everything we invested in you." Marcus had leaned back in his chair, smirking slightly, enjoying his position as the successful son. Jennifer had looked down at her plate, embarrassed but silent. Uncle Gerald had been quiet through all of this, just watching me with an expression I couldn't read. It was my father who delivered the final blow. "If you're going to insist on this blue-collar fantasy, then perhaps you should find another family to spend holidays with. We're not interested in watching you throw your life away." The silence that followed was absolute. I'd stood up slowly, folded my napkin, and placed it beside my plate. "Thank you for making that clear," I'd said, and walked out. I'd driven home through the dark, my hands gripping the steering wheel, and something hardened in my chest that night. A resolution. If they wanted me gone, I'd be gone. I wouldn't force my presence where it wasn't wanted. The years that followed were lonely but purposeful. I built my skills, worked for several contractors, learned every aspect of the trade. I saved money living in a small apartment, driving an old truck, eating simple meals. I read constantly, technical manuals and engineering books, teaching myself structural design and project management. At night, I'd sit at my small kitchen table, working through problems, planning hypothetical builds. I dated occasionally, but never seriously. Something in me had closed off after that Thanksgiving, a part of myself I kept protected. My few friends from high school gradually drifted away, busy with their own lives, their own families. I'd see their Christmas cards arrive for a few years, then those too stopped coming. I never called my parents. They never called me. Once, about 5 years after the break, I'd driven past their house, intending to stop, to try to bridge the gap. But I'd seen Marcus's car in the driveway, and Jennifer's too, and I'd kept driving.
I started my own small contracting business when I was 32, just me and my truck and the tools I'd accumulated. The work came slowly at first, small residential jobs, repairs and renovations. But I was meticulous and honest, and word spread. I underpromised and overdelivered. I showed up when I said I would. I finished jobs on time and within budget. A decade passed. My business grew steadily, carefully. I hired 2 employees, then 4, then 8. We took on larger projects, commercial renovations, full home reconstructions. I reinvested every profit back into the business, buying better equipment, training my crew, building a reputation for quality and reliability. I lived simply, never ostentatiously. My apartment was still small, my truck still old. My clothes were clean but worn. To anyone looking from the outside, I was exactly what my father had predicted, a man who'd chosen a modest, blue-collar life. And in many ways, that was true. But it was also my life, built on my terms, and I was proud of it. The news of my parents' deaths had reached me through a former neighbor who'd tracked down my business number. They died within 6 months of each other, my father from a heart attack, my mother from pneumonia. This was 7 years ago now. I'd attended neither funeral, not out of spite, but because I genuinely didn't know if I'd be welcome. Marcus and Jennifer had their own families by then, their own lives. We were strangers connected only by blood and a shared childhood that felt like it belonged to someone else. I'd mourned quietly, alone, in my own way. Not for who my parents had been in those final years, but for who they'd been when I was young, before expectations and disappointments had poisoned everything. I mourned the relationship we might have had if they'd been able to accept my choices. Sometimes, late at night, I'd wonder if they'd ever thought of me, if they'd ever regretted that Thanksgiving. But mostly, I focused on the present, on the work in front of me, on building something solid and real. Uncle Gerald had been my father's older brother, a successful architect in Philadelphia who'd never married and had no children. He'd been kind to me when I was young, showing me his drafting table, explaining how buildings were designed, how form and function worked together. I'd loved those visits, the smell of paper and ink, the precision of his drawings. After the estrangement, I'd assumed he'd sided with my father. We'd had no contact. I'd thought of him occasionally over the years, wondering if he was still alive, still working, but I'd never reached out. The shame of being the family reject had kept me silent. Now, standing in my kitchen with this letter, I realized he'd been alive all this time, living his life 3 states away, and I'd never known if he thought about me at all. The letter said the reading would be in 10 days, December 3rd, at 2 in the afternoon. I had 10 days to decide whether to go, to walk back into a family that had erased me, to face whatever waited there. I called my foreman, Robert, and told him I'd need a few days off. Family thing, I said, and he didn't press for details. Robert had worked for me for 12 years and knew I kept my personal life private. I booked a hotel in Philadelphia, not wanting to impose on anyone or create any awkward situations by asking where I might stay. The night before I left, I sat in my apartment and tried to imagine what the reading would be like. Would Marcus be there? Jennifer? Would they even recognize me? I looked different now than I had at 22, heavier in the shoulders from years of physical work, my hair graying at the temples, lines around my eyes from squinting at job sites in bright sun. I wore my best suit, the one I kept for rare business meetings. It was a modest navy suit, nothing expensive, but it was clean and pressed. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw a man who'd worked hard, who'd built something from nothing, who'd survived being cut off from his family and made a life anyway. That man, I thought, had nothing to be ashamed of. The law offices of Winters, Patterson, and Hart occupied the 8th floor of a modern building in downtown Philadelphia. The receptionist directed me to a conference room where 5 people were already seated around a polished table. Marcus was there, looking prosperous in an expensive suit, his hair still thick and dark. Jennifer sat beside him, designer handbag on the table, diamond earrings catching the light. A woman I didn't recognize sat across from them, middle-aged and elegant. and an older couple I vaguely remembered as cousins of my father. They all looked up when I entered, and I saw the recognition flash across Marcus's face, followed immediately by something harder to read. Surprise, certainly, but also something like discomfort. Jennifer's eyes widened. "Thomas," she said, and her voice carried genuine shock. "I didn't know you'd be here." I nodded to them both, taking a seat at the far end of the table, feeling like an intruder despite the invitation that had brought me here. The lawyer, a distinguished man in his 60s named Mr. Patterson, entered a moment later and closed the door behind him. Mr. Patterson opened a leather folder and adjusted his reading glasses, his face neutral and professional. "Thank you all for coming. We're here for the reading of the last will and testament of Gerald Matthew Brennan, who passed away on October 15th of this year." He paused, looking around the table. "Some of you may not be aware of all the provisions Mr. Brennan made, as he was quite specific about keeping certain matters confidential until after his death." I felt something tighten in my chest. Marcus had leaned forward slightly, his expression intent. Jennifer was gripping the edge of the table. Mr. Patterson continued, reading through the formal opening, the declaration of sound mind, the revocation of previous wills. Then he reached the bequests. Small amounts to charities, personal items to the cousins, a generous gift to the woman I didn't recognize, apparently a longtime friend. Then he said my name. "To my nephew Thomas James Brennan, I leave the entirety of my estate, including all properties, investments, and personal assets, with the exception of the specific bequests already mentioned."
The silence that followed was profound. I stared at Mr. Patterson, certain I'd misheard. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "That's impossible," he said, his voice tight. "There must be some mistake. Thomas hasn't even been part of this family for 30 years. He walked away from all of us." Mr. Patterson looked at Marcus calmly. "There is no mistake, Dr. Brennan. Your uncle was quite clear in his intentions, and the will is legally sound. He updated it 8 months ago." Jennifer was shaking her head, her face pale. "This doesn't make sense. Uncle Gerald never mentioned Thomas. He barely talked about him at all." I found my voice, though it came out rough. "What exactly does this mean? What estate?" Mr. Patterson turned to me, and his expression softened slightly. "Mr. Brennan, your uncle's estate is valued at approximately $4.3 million. That includes his home in Philadelphia, a vacation property in Maine, and a substantial investment portfolio. There are also his architectural archives, which he specified should be offered to the university he attended, though the decision is yours." I couldn't process the numbers. $4.3 million. It was an amount so far beyond my reality that it felt abstract, meaningless. Marcus was speaking, his voice rising. "This is absurd. Uncle Gerald obviously wasn't in his right mind. We need to contest this." Mr. Patterson remained calm. "Mr. Brennan, your uncle anticipated there might be questions about his mental capacity. He included a letter to be read after the primary provisions, which addresses this directly. Would you like me to read it now?" I nodded, unable to speak. Mr. Patterson pulled out another sheet of paper, this one covered in handwriting I vaguely recognized from childhood visits. "To my family," he began reading, and it was strange to hear Uncle Gerald's words in someone else's voice. "I know this will may come as a surprise to some of you. I want to be clear that I have made these provisions with a sound mind and clear conscience. For the past 28 years, I have watched my nephew Thomas live a life of integrity and purpose, even as he was rejected by the family he was born into. I was at that Thanksgiving dinner," Uncle Gerald's letter continued. "I heard how he was spoken to, dismissed and ridiculed for choosing a path that differed from family expectations. I saw him leave with dignity, and I saw none of you follow him, or apologize or attempt to understand. In the years since, I have watched from a distance. I hired a private investigator not to interfere, but to know how he was doing. I learned that Thomas built a successful business through hard work and honesty. I learned that he employed people and treated them fairly. I learned that he lived modestly despite his success, that he was respected in his community, that he had become exactly the kind of man I hoped he would be. a man of character and substance. Meanwhile, I watched the rest of you come to me only when you needed something. Money for investments, connections for careers, solutions to problems you'd created yourselves. You loved me for what I could provide, not for who I was. Thomas never asked me for anything because he didn't know I was watching, and that more than anything showed me his true character. Marcus had sunk back into his chair, his face flushed. Jennifer was crying quietly. I felt something breaking open inside me, something I'd kept locked and protected for nearly 3 decades. I want Thomas to have the security and recognition he deserves, the letter went on. I want him to know that someone in this family saw his worth, appreciated his choices, and is proud of the man he became. I only regret that I didn't tell him while I was alive. I was a coward in that regard. I allowed family politics to keep me silent when I should have reached out. Thomas, if you're hearing this, please forgive an old man his failings. And please know that you were never the disappointment your parents claimed you were. You were always enough. Mr. Patterson finished reading and looked up. The room was silent except for Jennifer's soft crying. I was gripping the arms of my chair, trying to maintain my composure, but my vision had blurred with tears. I refused to let fall in front of these people who'd rejected me so long ago. Marcus stood again, and this time his voice was different, quieter, almost defeated. I need to go, he said. He looked at me briefly, his expression complex, then walked out without another word. Jennifer remained, wiping her eyes with a tissue. Thomas, she started, but I shook my head. Not now, I said. Please, Mr. Patterson gave us a moment, then began explaining the practical matters. There were documents to sign, accounts to transfer, properties to inspect. He mentioned that Uncle Gerald's home contained personal effects I might want to review, including what he described as extensive files. Your uncle kept meticulous records, he said. I think you'll find them illuminating. I agreed to return the following day to begin sorting through everything. For now, I needed air, space, time to process what had just happened. Jennifer caught up with me in the parking garage. Thomas, wait, she called. I stopped, but didn't turn around. I'm sorry, she said from behind me. I'm sorry for all of it. For that night. For the years after. For not fighting for you. I turned to face her then. This sister I barely knew anymore. She looked older than I'd expected, stress lines around her mouth, her eyes tired beneath the makeup. Why didn't you? I asked simply. Why didn't any of you ever reach out? She shook her head, tears starting again. Pride, I think, and shame. After a few years, it felt like too much time had passed, like there was no way back. Mom and Dad never talked about you. It was like you'd never existed, and we just followed their lead. Marcus pretended he didn't care, but I know it bothered him. He'd see your company's trucks sometimes. Your business grew so much bigger than any of us realized. He looked you up online once, showed me your website. You have 40 employees now, major commercial contracts. You're successful, Thomas. Really successful. And we didn't know. We assumed you were struggling, barely making ends meet. And it turned out you'd built something real, something you could be proud of. I listened, feeling the weight of the lost years between us. I was proud of it, I said quietly. I am proud of it. I did it without family support, without approval, without anything but my own hands and determination. Uncle Gerald's house was a revelation, not just because it was beautiful, a 3-story townhouse in a historic district with original hardwood floors and tall windows that let in streams of afternoon light, but because of what I found in his study. Filing cabinets filled with newspaper clippings about my business, printouts of my company website from various years, photographs someone had taken from a distance of me at job sites, and letters. Dozens of letters he'd written but never sent, addressed to me, spanning nearly 3 decades. I sat at his desk and read them chronologically, watching myself grow up through his eyes. He'd written about being proud of my choice to follow my passion, about regretting his silence, about wanting to reach out but not knowing how, afraid of disrupting the life I'd built, afraid I wouldn't want contact with anyone from the family that had rejected me. In the last letter, dated 2 months before his death, he'd written about his diagnosis, the cancer that was spreading faster than treatments could slow. I realized I'd run out of time to do this the right way, he wrote. So I'm doing it the only way I have left. I stayed in Philadelphia for a week, sorting through Uncle Gerald's life, beginning the process of settling his estate. Jennifer visited twice, tentatively, and we had careful conversations that felt like strangers learning each other's language. Marcus never came back. I heard through Jennifer that he was angry, felt betrayed, couldn't understand why Uncle Gerald had chosen me. I understood his anger even if I couldn't sympathize with it. On my last evening in the city, I stood in Uncle Gerald's study one final time, looking at the drafting table where he'd once shown me how buildings came together, form and function in perfect balance. I thought about the young man I'd been, walking out of that Thanksgiving dinner with nothing but his dignity and determination. And I thought about the man I'd become, forged by rejection into someone who needed only his own approval to feel complete. Uncle Gerald's gift wasn't really about the money, though that would change my life in practical ways I was still beginning to grasp. His gift was recognition, validation, the knowledge that someone had been watching, had seen my worth, had been proud of me all along, and that meant more than any inheritance ever could.